The wind did not merely blow across the high plains of the Montana Territory. It screamed, a cacophony of lost souls tearing at the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, demanding entry into the only warmth for 50 miles. Arthur sat in the high-backed leather chair that had molded itself to his spine over a decade of solitary evenings, a glass of amber whiskey resting untouched on the heavy oak table beside him. The fire in the hearth was a roaring beast, snapping and hissing as it consumed the pine logs, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls that housed nothing but ghosts and silence. Arthur was a man etched by the land, his face a map of harsh winters and unforgiving suns, his eyes the color of steel tempered in a forge, carrying a weight that usually kept the world at a distance. He had come here to forget the noise of civilization, to bury a past that refused to stay dead. But tonight, the storm outside felt personal, a violent assault on his carefully constructed fortress of solitude. The snow was piling up against the door, drifting halfway up the windows, turning the world outside into a blinding white void where direction and hope ceased to exist. He was just about to rise and dampen the fire for the night, resigning himself to the howling dark, when a sound cut through the gale, a sound so faint, so fragile, that he initially dismissed it as a trick of the wind or a branch snapping under the weight of the ice. But then it came again, a rhythmic, desperate thumping against the thick wood of the front door, followed by a silence that was heavier than the storm itself. Arthur did not hesitate. He moved with the surprising grace of a predator, grabbing the heavy iron latch and throwing his shoulder against the wood to force it open against the drifting snow. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and filling the room with a swirling vortex of ice and freezing air. There, collapsed on the threshold, half buried in the white powder, lay a figure so small and broken it seemed impossible that life still clung to it. He dropped to his knees, the snow instantly soaking through his trousers, and scooped the bundle into his arms. It was light, terrifyingly light, like a bird with hollow bones. He kicked the door shut against the screaming night, sealing them back inside the sanctuary of the firelight, and turned to look at what the storm had delivered to his doorstep. Arthur laid the stranger on the bearskin rug before the hearth, his movements urgent but gentle, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, jarring intrusion of human fragility into his iron-clad existence. As the firelight washed over the figure, Arthur peeled back the sodden, frozen layers of strange, silken fabric that were woefully inadequate for a western winter. It was a woman. Her hair, black as a raven's wing and slick with melting ice, was plastered to a face that was pale with the blue tint of hypothermia. She was Chinese, a rarity in these parts, her features delicate and etched with a kind of porcelain beauty that seemed entirely out of place in this brutal, unforgiving wilderness. She was shivering violently, her body convulsing in shock, and Arthur knew he had to get her warm immediately, or the cold would claim her even here, inches from the fire. He began to carefully remove the wet outer garments, his eyes respectful but clinical, searching for injuries. But what he found beneath the ruin of her silk dress made his breath hitch in his throat and his blood run cold in his veins. Her skin, which should have been smooth, was a canvas of cruelty. Violently purple bruises bloomed across her ribs and shoulders, dark and angry against the pale flesh, marks that were unmistakably the result of a heavy hand. But it was not just the bruises that froze him, it was the scars. Thin, white lines crisscrossing her back and arms, old wounds layered beneath fresh horrors, telling a story of prolonged, systematic suffering. Around her left ankle, the skin was raw and chafed, a circular band of abrasion that suggested she had been shackled or tied for a long time. Arthur had seen men die of gunshot wounds, had seen cattle torn apart by wolves, had seen the worst of what nature could do to a living thing. But this was different. This was the deliberate malice of a man. A surge of dark, protective fury rose in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, hot and suffocating. He quickly grabbed the heavy wool blankets from his bed, wrapping her tightly, creating a cocoon of warmth, and then hurried to heat water in the kettle, his mind racing with the implications of her arrival. Who had done this? And how far had she run, bleeding and freezing, to escape them? The hours bled into the night, the storm outside raging with undiminished fury, while inside the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman on the floor. Arthur sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his own heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm of vigilance. Sometime deep in the witching hour, her breathing changed, hitching suddenly, and her eyes flew open. They were dark, terrified, and darting around the room like a trapped animal seeking an exit that didn't exist. She tried to scramble backward, away from the heat, away from him, a whimper escaping her throat that sounded more like a wounded creature than a human being. "Easy," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse but laced with a gentleness he didn't know he still possessed. He held up his hands, palms open, showing he held no weapon, no malice. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. The storm caught you." The woman froze, her back pressed against the rough legs of his heavy table, her eyes wide and fixed on his face, searching for the deceit she evidently expected from any man. She did not speak, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the wool blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. Arthur moved slowly, pouring a cup of the warm broth he had prepared, the steam rising in curling ribbons between them. He slid the cup across the floorboards until it rested halfway between them, then retreated back to his chair, giving her the space she desperately needed. "Drink," he urged softly. "It will help the cold." She stared at the cup, then back at him, her gaze dropping to the bruises on her arms, then returning to his face with a look of confusion. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't striking her. He was simply sitting there, a mountain of a man in the flickering light, waiting. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, she reached a trembling hand out from the blanket, her fingers brushing the ceramic mug. She lifted it to her lips, the warmth seeming to shock her, and took a sip. Then another. Arthur watched, feeling a strange tightness in his chest loosen slightly. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it he saw something else, a fierce, burning resolve. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor who had walked into a blizzard rather than stay where she was. "My name is Arthur," he said into the quiet. She lowered the cup, the liquid trembling, and for the first time her voice emerged, a whisper of broken sound, melodic and terrified. "May," she breathed. The morning brought no relief from the weather. If anything, the world had been erased completely by a wall of white that pressed against the windows, sealing the cabin into a twilight gloom. Arthur moved about the small space with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire and checking the larder, acutely aware of May's eyes following his every movement. She had not moved from the corner near the hearth, wrapped in the blankets like a statue of sorrow, but the panic from the night before had settled into a wary, high-strung tension. She flinched when he dropped a piece of firewood, her body curling in on itself instinctively, a reflex born of conditioned fear. It broke his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible, cracking the callous shell he had built around his emotions. He busied himself repairing a leather harness at the table, the rhythmic sound of the awl punching through hide filling the silence, offering a predictable, non-threatening noise. "The snow is too deep," Arthur said without looking up, addressing the unspoken question hanging in the air. "We are snowed in, maybe for days." He paused, glancing at her. "No one can get up here, and no one can get down." He saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction, at the news. The isolation that usually plagued him was now her greatest comfort. It meant safety. It meant the demons chasing her could not cross the threshold. May watched his hands, strong, scarred hands that worked with precision and patience. They were hands capable of violence, she knew that. She had seen the rifle by the door and the knife at his belt. but they moved with a care that confused her. Her husband Lee had hands that were soft, uncalloused by labor, yet they inflicted pain with a creativity that made her soul shrivel. Lee was a powerful merchant, a man who owned people the way Arthur owned cattle, and he had bought her as an ornament, a thing to be broken and displayed. He will come," May said suddenly, her English heavily accented but clear, the words dropping into the room like stones. Arthur stopped working, laying the leather strip down on the table. He turned his chair fully toward her, his expression darkening. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. "Lie," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse. "My husband. He thinks I am his property. He does not lose his property." Arthur looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his steel-gray eyes. "He won't find you today," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a dangerous promise. "And when the snow clears, let him come. This is my land, and you are under my roof." By the third day, the cabin had transformed from a shelter into a small, shared universe. The storm continued to rage, a relentless siege that made the world outside irrelevant. Inside, a quiet routine began to form, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of their different worlds. May, though still weak and moving with a limp that made Arthur wince in sympathy, began to insist on helping. She refused to be idle, perhaps fearing that usefulness was the only currency that purchased safety. She took over the cooking, taking the simple dried venison and root vegetables Arthur provided and turning them into stews that tasted richer, more complex than anything he had eaten in years. Arthur watched her as she moved around the fire, her silhouette stark against the glow. She had washed the silk dress, though it was ruined, and wore one of his heavy flannel shirts that hung on her frame like a robe, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. It should have looked comical, but on her it looked dignified, a mantle of survival. He found himself finding excuses to be near the hearth, fixing things that didn't need fixing, just to be in the orbit of her quiet presence. They spoke little, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of suspicion. It was a companionable silence, loaded with unspoken questions and tentative answers. That evening, as the wind rattled the roof shingles, Arthur noticed May shivering again, though the fire was high. He stood up and went to the large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, pulling out a thick, gray wool quilt, a quilt his mother had made a lifetime ago, a relic of a softer time. He walked over to where May sat, and without a word, draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened for a second, then looked up at him. Her eyes, usually cast down in submission, met his. In the firelight, he saw a depth of gratitude that humbled him, but also a flicker of something else, a recognition of the man beneath the scars, just as he had recognized the steel beneath her bruises. She pulled the quilt tighter, her fingers brushing against his hand for the briefest of moments. The contact was electric, a spark that jumped the gap between them, startling them both. Arthur pulled his hand back slowly, not wanting to break the spell, but afraid of the intensity of it. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not being him." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "I could never be him," he replied roughly, turning back to the window to watch the snow, knowing that when the storm broke, the real danger would begin, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that he would burn the world down before he let anyone take her back. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, a heavy, crystalline stillness that rang in the ears louder than the gale that had preceded it. On the morning the wind finally died, the sun rose over a world transformed, the landscape buried under 4 feet of pristine, blinding white that smoothed the jagged edges of the wilderness into gentle, treacherous undulations. Arthur opened the heavy oak door, the wood groaning against the drift, and shoveled a path to the woodpile, his breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke. May stood in the doorway, wrapped in the gray quilt, her eyes squinting against the harsh brilliance of the sun reflecting off the snowpack. For the first time in days, the tension in her shoulders seemed to ebb, replaced by a tentative awe at the sheer scale of the isolation surrounding them. It was a beautiful, deadly cathedral of ice, and for a moment the threat of Lee felt distant, swallowed by the vastness of the Montana Territory. Arthur returned with an armful of logs, stomping the snow from his boots, and caught her watching the horizon, not with fear, but with a quiet, contemplative longing. He paused, the rough bark of the pine digging into his gloves, realizing that in the span of a few days the cabin had shifted from a place of solitary confinement to a shared sanctuary. He placed the wood by the hearth and turned to her, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. "The pass will be blocked for another week," he said, his voice low. "But the drifts are firm enough to walk on if you have snowshoes." May turned, pulling the quilt tighter. "I have nowhere to walk to," she answered softly, the truth of it hanging between them. "This is the only place the wind has not reached." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the steel spine beneath the porcelain skin. "Then we make it ready," he said, "because the quiet doesn't last forever." That night, over a meal of roasted rabbit and winter root stew, Arthur broke his own rule of silence. He spoke of the empty chair, of the wife and daughter taken by a fever 10 years prior, the ghosts that usually kept him company. He offered the story not as a plea for pity, but as an exchange of currency, his scars for hers. May listened, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears, and in the flickering light, the distance between their two broken lives narrowed until it was just a step across the hearth. The peace held for 2 more days, a fragile, suspended reality where the only battles were against the cold and the encroaching dark. But the thaw began on the 7th day, the sun turning the surface of the snow into a glittering slush that froze hard as iron by nightfall. It was the sound of the crust breaking that alerted Arthur first, the crunch of heavy hooves punching through the ice layer, echoing up the valley like gunshots. He was splitting kindling on the porch when he heard it, and he didn't need to look up to know that the outside world had finally come crashing back in. He straightened slowly, the axe resting easy in his hand, his eyes scanning the tree line until he saw them. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the blinding white, picking their way slowly up the rise toward the cabin. May was inside, but she sensed the shift in his posture through the open door. She appeared at the threshold, her face draining of blood as she recognized the lead horse, a massive black stallion adorned with silver tack that glinted maliciously in the sun. "It is him," she whispered, the tremor in her voice threatening to shatter her composure. Arthur did not turn, but he reached back with his free hand, pushing her gently but firmly behind the doorframe. "Go inside," he commanded, his voice devoid of fear, filled only with a cold, terrifying calculation. "Load the rifle. Do not come out unless I tell you." May hesitated, her hand gripping his sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. "He will kill you," she breathed. Arthur looked at her then, his eyes hard as flint. "He can try," he said, "but he's not on his land anymore. He's on mine." He stepped off the porch, planting his boots in the snow, a singular, immovable object between the approaching riders and the woman trembling in the shadows of his home. He waited, the axe handle warm in his grip as the riders drew rein 10 yards away, the steam from their horses confusing the air between them. Lee sat atop his horse with the arrogance of a king surveying a rebellious province, his fine silk coat lined with fur, a stark contrast to Arthur's rough-spun wool and leather. He was a handsome man, in a sharp, cruel way, his face unlined by the hardships that defined Arthur, his hands gloved in soft kid skin. He looked at Arthur with a sneering dismissal, his gaze flicking past the rancher to the cabin door. "You have something of mine," Lee said, his English perfect, clipped and cold. He didn't ask. He stated, as if the return of his property was a foregone conclusion. Behind him, 3 hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands resting casually near the revolvers at their hips. Arthur didn't blink. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, the axe resting head down in the snow, a posture of relaxed lethality. "I have nothing of yours," Arthur rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly across the clearing. "I have a guest, and she isn't leaving." Lee laughed, a sharp barking sound that had no humor in it. "She is my wife," Lee spat, the veneer of politeness slipping to reveal the rage beneath. "She is my property. I paid for her, I own her, and I will take her back. Step aside, old man, or I will burn this shack down around your ears." Arthur took a slow breath, the air tasting of pine and impending violence. "She walked through a blizzard to get away from you," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You put marks on her that no man has a right to put on a woman. You want her? You have to step down off that horse and walk through me." The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. Lee's face twisted, his pride stung by the defiance of this dirt-poor rancher. He signaled to the man on his right, a subtle nod. The hired gun went for his pistol, but Arthur was faster. In a blur of motion he kicked the axe up, catching the handle and hurling it in a spinning arc. It struck the gunman in the shoulder, knocking him from the saddle with a scream before his weapon could clear leather. Chaos erupted. The gunshot that followed cracked the air like a whip, but it didn't come from the riders. From the cabin window, a puff of smoke bloomed as May fired Arthur's Winchester, the bullet striking the ground inches from Lee's horse, causing the stallion to rear violently. Lee fought for control, shouting curses in Cantonese, while the other 2 hired hands struggled with their spooked mounts. Arthur used the distraction to close the distance, pulling the heavy Colt revolver from his belt. He didn't fire wildly. He was a man who counted every bullet. He put a round into the leg of the second rider, sending him toppling into the snow, and leveled the gun at Lee, who had finally brought his horse under control. The remaining hired hand, seeing the tide turn so abruptly, wheeled his horse around and fled, abandoning his pay for his life. Lee was left alone, staring down the barrel of Arthur's gun, his face a mask of shock and fury. "She is nothing!" Lee screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the cabin. "She is broken goods!" Arthur stepped closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "She is a human being," Arthur said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "and she is done with you." May stepped out onto the porch then, the rifle held steady in her hands, her face pale but resolute. She looked at the husband who had tormented her, who had treated her as less than an animal, and she did not flinch. "Go," she said, her voice ringing clear in the frozen air. "Go and never come back, or the next one will not miss." Lee looked from Arthur's grim visage to May's newfound strength, realizing that his power here had evaporated. He was outnumbered not by guns, but by a will stronger than his own. With a snarl of impotent rage, he wheeled his stallion around and galloped back down the trail, disappearing into the glare of the snow. Arthur watched the trail long after Lee had vanished, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. He turned to find May still standing on the porch, the rifle lowered, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. He walked up the steps, the snow crunching loudly under his boots, and gently took the weapon from her hands. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of regret, but found only relief. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands reaching out to brush the snow from his coat, a gesture of intimacy that felt natural now. "No," Arthur lied, ignoring the ache in his shoulder where he had slammed into the doorframe during the scramble. "I'm fine." He looked at the blood on the snow where the hired hand had fallen, a stark reminder of how close violence always hovered. "He won't come back," Arthur said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "Men like that, they only fight when they think they can win easy. He knows now. He knows the cost is too high." May nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of a burden she had carried for years. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, and for the first time in his life, Arthur didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms around her, his heavy coat enveloping her, offering a shield against the cold world. They stood there for a long time, two scarred souls holding each other up in the aftermath of the storm, realizing that they had saved each other in more ways than one. The silence of the winter wilderness returned, but it was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. Weeks later, the first true signs of spring began to break the stranglehold of winter. The snow receded from the lower pastures, revealing patches of brown earth that smelled of wet soil and promise. The creek, which had been a frozen ribbon of silence, began to sing again, the water rushing clear and cold over the stones. Arthur stood by the corral fence, repairing a rail, the sun warm on his back. He watched May walking up from the stream, a basket of early greens in her hand, her step lighter, the limp almost entirely gone. She wore a dress she had sewn from fabric he had brought from the trading post in town, a deep blue that matched the sky above. She stopped when she saw him watching, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips, a sight that still felt like a miracle to him. She didn't look like a stranger anymore. She looked like she belonged to the land and to the life they were building. The scars were still there, on her skin and in his heart, but they were no longer open wounds. They were maps of where they had been, reminders of the strength it took to survive. Arthur put down his hammer and walked to meet her, the air between them charged with a quiet, enduring love that didn't need grand declarations. He took the basket from her, his hand brushing hers, and they turned together toward the cabin. It wasn't a palace, just logs and mortar, but as the chimney smoke drifted lazily into the blue sky, Arthur knew it was finally, truly, a home. They had weathered the worst the world could throw at them, the blizzard, the violence, the past, and they had come out the other side, not just alive, but whole.